Hey everyone, this is Pathmetrics. Welcome to episode 15 of Mixing Loud with Clip to Zero. In this video, I'll be explaining and demonstrating some key ideas about low-end control and taking care of your sub-region and bass region in the context of the Clip to Zero method. And as a quick reminder for people that are encountering this video for the first time, this is part of an entire series called Mixing Loud with Clip to Zero. It's a separate playlist on my channel, and I'm going to assume that you're familiar with some of the other concepts and techniques I've already explained. Okay, so now I want to talk about low end. Low end is absolutely the biggest challenge for most of you out there, especially for new producers. It is really, really difficult to accurately hear the low end and hear the detail in the low end. And by low end, I mean mostly the sub-region, and then maybe the little low bass region that sits just above it between about 100 hertz to 200 hertz. Most of us, if we're home producers, we're in crappy, tiny little bedroom studios or little office spaces in a house, tiny little rooms. You probably haven't bothered to put up any kind of serious acoustic treatment or bass traps, especially, which are big and bulky and eat up a lot of the actual space in your room. You may live in an apartment. You can't just put up all this stuff on your walls. And also, most of us home producers are using very small near-field monitors. You're using tiny little monitors with, your biggest driver on it is 5 inches, maybe 6 inches, maybe 7, maybe even an 8-inch near-field, which is like a massive monster on your typical desk. And that's literally all you'll have in an untreated room, if you have that. And you can't hear your low end at all because, first of all, even the 8-inch drivers aren't putting out enough energy for you to really hear the sub-region. And second of all the reflections and room modes in your tiny little room are just completely warping your perception of every frequency in the sub-range because they're creating all these little standing waves in your room and these high pressure areas and low pressure areas, and you can literally move your head 6 inches and a note that sounded quieter a second ago in the sub-range will sound slightly louder just because you moved your head into a different pressure node in your room. So it's really, really difficult. So, you can do a better job by putting on headphones with a good low end. But even there, it's tiny little drivers next to your ears, and it helps a lot, but it's still not super detailed. And even if you're in a room with bigger 8-inch near fields, and you've treated your room as well as you possibly can, it's still never perfect. And those small drivers on your near fields, 3 feet, 4 feet from your head, they don't have enough time to really develop the sub wave. You're not hearing the real thing, right? So what I'm getting at here is you typically need to hear the low end really well if you're going to work in a traditional kind of, through speakers approach. You pretty much need big far field monitors. I'm talking the big expensive monitors that sit 6 feet away from you, 7, 8 feet away from you. Maybe they're soffit fitted into the wall in front of you. And you need really good room treatment to even begin to hear your low end accurately and with a lot of detail, right? Or, especially in the bass music communities, the electronic dance music communities, a lot of us will swear up and down by a transducer, which is basically a big subwoofer that you sit your back up against in a chair, or you literally mount it into the chair underneath you, and it's vibrating the sub-region directly into your spine or your butt. Okay, so like drummers use something called, there's different types by different names, but one that comes to mind is the butt kicker. Drummers will often mount one of these transducers under their drum throne to help them, feel their own kick drum. Because in a loud stage situation, you can't hear crap, right? You've got in-ear monitors and everything's muffling the sound of your kick drum. And So sometimes having a transducer in your drum throne is really helpful in a live situation. And producers tend to prefer sub packs because they're comfortable and you just lean your back up against it in a chair. But I know producers who will also use something like a butt kicker under their chair. But it's a big pain in the butt to find these things. They're kind of expensive. And if you get something made for a drum throne, it can be hard to retrofit it for your chair. Sub packs are always on short supply. And especially with the supply chain issues we're having lately, you might not even be able to get one, but they can help you feel the things you can't hear. They're very accurate. They really give you a good sense of what I said in this line here, which is your big challenge is listening for sounds in the low end that are rubbing, like a rub feel or a roughness, rumble, or pumping. It's really hard to distinguish those with your ears with small speakers, right? So either big far fields and good room treatment or a transducer, or this is probably honestly these days one of the more practical and things that you can actually get your hands on right now. And it's expensive. Slate VSX is about $500. It's a set of headphones and a special kind of software that emulate a lot of different listening environments. And in fact, it's what I personally use lately. My sub pack is now sitting in the closet. I don't need it anymore because Slate VSX tells me everything I need. What's nice about a headphone-based system is it completely takes your room out of the equation. It doesn't matter if you're in a small room, a big room. It doesn't matter if you're in your own house where you usually work or a different producer's house or a different studio or a hotel room. Slate VSX is always going to sound like Slate VSX. And once you get used to the sound of it, it's very dependable. Let me show it to you briefly, just so you know what I'm talking about, because not everyone's seen it. If we go over to my listen bus, right now you're hearing all this sound without VSX. But if I turn on VSX, things are going to sound not necessarily good to you, and they won't sound the same way for you as they do for me, because I'm hearing them through a matched pair of headphones that's built specifically for this system. You're not. So it's going to sound different for you, but you'll hear a difference. And that's just my starting sound. Let me show you what it actually looks like. So that's a pair of barefoot midfields in a control room that looks like this. Here's the same sound in a different system through these big soffit-fitted far fields in this particular room. So you can hear the difference, right? Now, to you, this may sound unnatural. It may sound bad. To me, my brain is used to the way these are supposed to sound. And to me, these sound actually really, really good on these headphones and so much more detailed than just flat headphones with none of this on it. But we can go much further because there's all these other emulations in here, right? These are only two of the control rooms. There's other control rooms with different types of midfields and far fields and near fields. And then they have a car simulation, an SUV simulation with a big subwoofer in the back, a club emulation. And then you can double check certain problems that are typical on small bricks and boom boxes or even Apple EarPods and so on and so forth. So this is the one I want you to really hear is the club and SUV and car emulations, which I put on these three quick access buttons. So I'm gonna whip through all these real quick, and we're gonna land on the club, and I'll keep going. And we're going to stop on this one because this is super useful, especially if you do dance music. So here's the problem. It's really, 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 really hard to hear problems in the low end unless you're on the biggest speakers possible. And there isn't, I mean, an SUV with a big subwoofer sitting in the back is definitely one place where the sub is hyped up and prominent in the mix, and you can hear more detail that you can't hear. And this is why people often do a car test. And if you have an SUV with a big sub in it, that's how you can really hear your low end better than just in the studio, even on your own expensive studio monitors. But for dance music and bass music, nothing beats a club, because now you're hearing it on a big array with big subwoofers in a large space that is full of very unfortunate room reflections, right? Clubs are definitely not clean listening environments. So they're overhyped with sub, they're overhyped with low end, they're extremely reflective and reverberant. And this is a really good emulation of a club in Los Angeles, and it shows all the nasty, dirty problems with your low end in just such glaring detail. And so I love this emulation because it's how I check for typical problems that I'm trying to recommend you somehow find a way to be able to listen for, which is rub, roughness, rumble, and pumping. So the way you hear these things is you solo the low end and you listen for problems. And what I'm going to do, the hard part is knowing what to listen for, and it's much easier to hear it in this emulation. And once you know what it sounds like, what the problem sounds like in an emulation like this, it's much easier to hear it on big speakers and even near fields. But if you've never heard this problem before, it's harder to hear. So I'm hoping this translates well enough to your headphones or whatever you're listening on in YouTube that you can kind of get an idea of what to listen for, even if you don't have access to a system like this. So let's see how to do this. The first thing you're going to want is some way to isolate different frequencies in your sound. I like this tool. It's fairly cheap. It's by the same people who make DP Meter 5, which I recommended, this company called TB Pro Audio. And it's just a really convenient way to solo different bands and then also turn up the output and do some other tricks. So yeah, we'll talk about the kicks first. So with kicks, in the super loud genres, especially the dance music genres, maybe some of you have heard deadmau5 ranting about kicks, okay? There's some famous rants running around out there on YouTube about deadmau5 saying a kick is just a transient. What is this tuning a kick crap? Kicks are just short little transients. That's all they are. If you make a kick too boomy, all you're going to hear in a club is just whoa, 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 whoa. And he's right. He's right. There's a reason dance music kicks tend to be short and knocky and not really natural and boomy, okay? Like a rock kick or something like that, right? Dance music kicks are really problematic because of environments like this club environment with massive bass and really terrible reflections that cause all sorts of comb filtering and room modes and standing waves, right? So what you want to listen for with a kick is a kind of rub or boing, a kind of springy boing sound on the kick tail. And it's really obvious with an emulation like this. So check it out. I built this track to highlight some of these problems, and because I knew I was going to talk about them with you eventually. So the original kick looked like this. So on near field monitors, sounds pretty good, right? Maybe a little echoey to you, a little phasey maybe because of the way VSX works. Let me bypass this real quick. Okay, this is no VSX. This is just the pure original signal coming to your listening environment. So ignore what you see here. Right? That sounds like a perfectly good kick. Not too thin and knocky, not boomy, not super boomy, but it's got a thud, a bottom end to it, right? All right. Now, when we go to VSX and we listen to this on a typical midfield monitor, still sounds pretty good. We go to some far fields sitting back here, more like 7 feet away from us. Still sounds good, right? We go to a car. Okay, it sounds a little hollow, a little phasey, but don't worry about it. It's an emulation and it's a small little car. SUV. Now there, you start to hear the problem. Listen close. What's wrong with this kick? Do you hear how it has a bit of a long, weird, almost like a swell up on the tail? Listen for that. Now let's go to the club emulation and you're going to hear it really, really in your face. Hear that long grr, 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 grr. It's not very defined anymore. It's fuzzy. It's muddy. It's got all this weird grr, 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 kind of hidden in its timbre. Hear that ba 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 ba. That's what happens to so many kicks when you hear your mix for the first time in a big club and you go, oh crap, I picked the wrong kick. I did not process that kick very well. Now watch what happens when we clean up the kick by simply making it shorter. Like I'm literally going to take it right to here, chop it off at this point, and then I've got a little bit of an extra fade on it to, lower and smooth this down. And this is, let's see, let's bring up the oscilloscope too so you can see what this looks like before and after. All right, so here's the original long kick. So you hear that rub, right? You hear that roughness on the tail. It's just too drawn out and rubby and it chatters. Now we shorten this up and give it a little bit of a fade so it'll have the same general fast, slopey fade at the end. And watch now and listen now. Hear how it's tighter and more defined? You still hear the thud. You still hear the overall timbre of the kick, but it doesn't have that long, drawn out. Now let me just drag this back and forth so you can hear the short kick versus a long kick. Hear the difference? It's a massive difference in this particular emulation. It's the kind of thing that unless you're a DJ and you go out and sort of test your early mixes in a club, you may never notice that there's anything wrong with this kick because you're going to be hearing your kick on speakers that sound more like this. Now here, the difference is not very pronounced at all, long versus short. Right? Not too much of a difference unless you know what you're listening for and you're listening super close. It's a little more obvious on these slightly bigger speakers, but it's still, you got to know what to listen for. Okay, so on these speakers, I've had people describe it as rumble, although it's not strictly rumble. Rumble is low frequency noise coming in from a microphone when you're recording something with a microphone. It's like your air conditioning and your HVAC and air moving and trucks rolling by outside with their low explosion sounds from their engine. That's rumble. It's truly noise. This isn't strictly rumble. I think of it more as rub or roughness. And it's being caused by a whole lot of things. It's not it's not really the fault of the kick tail being long. It's the fault of the pitch drop that is usually baked into kicks. Look carefully at these waveforms. See how they're closer and skinnier here, but then they get longer and fatter as you get towards the tail. That means there's a constant pitch drop from the transient all the way through probably the early part of the tail. And when you have a pitch drop in the subregion, and you've got those sounds reflecting in an environment, and an early sound from when it's up here in this pitch bounces back off of a wall and merges with the sound that's reflecting from this part of the kick, you're getting phasing between those two frequencies that are super close together. And just the way that the reflections are merging and mingling in the air of a big space on a big system that's emphasizing this subrange stuff, it's going to really, really, really highlight a phasing problem, right? So typically we want short, knocky kicks in super loud genres that are meant to be played in clubs because it gets rid of this phasing problem from the pitch drop. And this is something to just listen for, because if you've got all this rub and roughness and weird chattery movement in your low end, it's going to make your low end muddy, and it's going to also create problems with all your other sounds that also need to be merged and mixed and blended with what's happening in the subregion. So cleaning up your kick is a pretty important thing to do, and once you know what to listen for, you can kind of listen for it if you have the right environment to hear it in the first place. Okay, so that's probably all I want to say about kicks. Now, subs have a different set of challenges associated with them. So what I'm going to do for the sub is let you hear two different versions of a sub. So the first sub you're going to hear is the one that I used in this song, and it sounds like this. All right. Now here's a very clean sub with no harmonics on it. For most of you, they'll sound probably almost exactly the same. Or if you're listening on your phone or your MacBook speakers or something small, you probably couldn't even hear the second sub, this clean sub. You probably could hear the first sub, or the first sub was perceptually more louder. Now, they're the same exact loudness, the same exact amplitude, but one of them sounds different and it sounds louder. And let's take a look at what this actually looks like on a spectrum analyzer. And we're going to use a really detailed spectrum analyzer. This will be a little wonky because it literally runs as its own standalone app, and I'll have to keep bringing it back to the foreground. But here's the clean sub. We're in this second sub down here. It's very clean. Watch what the spectrum looks like. It's literally one single fundamental sign and nothing else. Now, if we go to the sub that I actually used in this song, it's a bit different. See all these harmonics? And see how far these harmonics extend up into the spectrum? They're going, to 700, 800K. And they're really prominent up through about 500 hertz, and especially the first, third and fifth harmonics, right? And seventh, right around here. It's very different sounding, and there's a lot more spectral energy. Now, I had someone ask a question the other day that kind of blew my mind a little bit. They're like, why don't you low pass your sub to get rid of all those harmonics? Shouldn't you be low passing your sub at around 100 to 150 hertz? I'm like, no. So I need to make this point. I decided to make this point in this video. Subs usually need harmonics. Really, please, I don't know where you've heard this advice, but please don't low pass them down around 100, 150. That's totally wrong, and I'm going to show you why. Harmonics help your sub, first of all, they help your sub to be audible on really small speakers and earbuds. Those speakers in your MacBook or whatever laptop you have, they typically can't reproduce anything at all below about 100 hertz. And, even though Apple EarPods and earbuds are pretty marvelous pieces of design engineering, they still can't really stand up and reproduce something super low very easily. So harmonics that are sitting up above 100 hertz help the sub to be perceived. You're not really hearing the sub, but you're hearing the harmonics of the sub, and so you can still hear kind of subliminally, because it's fairly low in the mix, you can hear what the sub is doing. So just as a really quick example, we're going to come over here and use the EarPod emulation. And we're going to listen to these two subs. Now let me just flip back and forth between them real quick. Here's with harmonics on the top, without harmonics on the bottom. Okay, so that's one situation where harmonics are very helpful, helping your sublines themselves actually be kind of perceived on small speakers. But there's another really big reason to have harmonics on your sub. And this is the one that, again, unless you have a room that lets you hear the low end really clear, is difficult to understand. So what I'm going to do is flip back to the club emulation. I'm going to let you hear the problem by playing the clean sub first, and I'm going to bring in this meter, and I want you to watch what's happening when the kick hits versus the sub here. Do you hear how it's going boom, 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 boom? There's like a delay. There's like this almost tangible delay between the kick hit and then pitching down to where the sub hits on the downbeat. Even though they're crossfaded and ducked to be seamless in the full spectrum, here in this overhyped bass environment with reflections, you're hearing this boingy kind of delay between the kick and the sub. One more time, listen. Okay, now listen to the same thing, but with the sub that has all the harmonics on it. Do you hear how the kick and the sub sound like more of one unit now? One hit? I'm going to leave the monitor off, the meter off, and we're just going to go back and forth. And now listen for that delay feel when it's a clean sub versus the not very delayed at all and sounds more like one thing when I go to the sub with harmonics in it. what's happening is when there are extra harmonics on the sub, the third harmonic, the fifth harmonic, the seventh harmonic, all those peaks you saw pretty high in the spectrum going up past like 200 and 300 and 400 hertz, all the way up to around 500 hertz. They're kind of providing this continuous sound that's masking the interaction between the kick and the sub being sidechained out. It seems odd because even those harmonics are getting sidechained, but it's something about the low end. If the only focus for your ears is the pure fundamental of the sub down around 40 hertz or wherever it is, and the kick at around 55 hertz or wherever it is, if all you hear are those two fundamentals interacting, you can hear the gap caused by the side chaining. Okay, you can hear the pumping gap. But when all those extra harmonics come in, they're masking that and somehow evening out that interaction of the gap. And they're much more constant sounding, and your ear and your brain picks up on those more. The end result is it sounds like more of a glued, cohesive thing, a single thing, instead of two disconnected things. So that's why you hear that delay, that gap, that pump, when it's just a clean sub versus a sub with harmonics on it, because those harmonics are sort of masking and gluing the interaction of the kick and the snare down in that super, super low end. And again, it's very easy to hear in an emulation like this, where the reflections and the sound and the way that they modeled the impulse response of this room, it's just very different than if we listen to it even on these big far fields. You're not going to hear the problem nearly as much. Listen to the two here with this emulation. This is the one that has the gap at the bottom. This is the one that sounds much more glued together because of the harmonics in the top. See, once your ears know what to listen for, you can still hear that dwee, 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 dwee on every kick, right? When it's the clean sub, but it sounds like one sound when you're using the sub with harmonics. So listen for that slight dwee, dwee kind of sound. So that gap, that pump, is the kind of thing a sub pack or a transducer used to tell me, but now I can hear it in my headphones because of these, these wild emulations that really highlight problem areas in different environments. So your mileage may vary. I think I beat that one to death. It's a subtle point. Hopefully you could hear what I was trying to demonstrate to you, but at the end of the day, you really, 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 really need to hear your low end clearly enough and listen for this kind of rubbing and pumping that is very common both in your kick itself with a tail that's too long and in the sidechain ducking interaction between your kick and your tail. Okay? Harmonics on the sub help not only be audible on small speakers, but it also helps with that sidechain pumping and lets you have, longer sidechain depths and lengths to minimize how much your sub is stacking up with your kick tail, and therefore how much a clipper or limiter has to crush those peaks back down to zero and squash out your kick and sub and make them sound rubbery and dead and squashed, right? So this is a fine nuance, especially for super loud dance genres, but it's something to be aware of, and I know a lot of producers aren't aware of it. And so again, when it comes to the sub itself, if for some reason you want a clean sub, my advice is to make one. Don't just low pass out all the harmonics, like I've heard claimed is a supposedly good thing to do. And let me see if I can show you why that is the case. Let's go back to the sub here. Let's just go back to the one with the harmonics. And we're going to pull up FabFilter Pro Q3. Now you'll notice I do have a low pass on here, but that's only because the specific harmonics on this sub, watch how far they extend way up here. See this little area way up here in the 1 to 2K range, 3K, 4K range? They're so low to the noise floor. They're so tiny. And they're way up here in this range where you don't need any hint of a sub, right? Where you need to hear your sub on small speakers and large speakers alike is mostly this area up through here. Right about here. Which is about 700 hertz, right? This is kind of my line for subs. As long as I can hear the harmonics up through 700, 800 hertz at full volume without attenuating them at all, that's going to make it audible. That's going to help mask interactions between the kick and the sub and so on, like I just showed you. So this high pass way up here at 1200 hertz is perfectly fine because all I'm trying to do is attenuate these super high harmonics that are super low down towards the noise floor. They just don't need to exist, and it's a gentle 12 dB filter, so it's fine, right? Now, if I were to crank this over farther towards advice I heard the other day that was like, really? I don't think so. Let's crank this over to like 140, 150. Let's put it right around 150, okay? And let's make it steep, because that's another thing I heard is like, 48 slope at 150 hertz, because all you want to hear is the sub. You don't want any of this low mid-range stuff interacting with your mid basses. That was the basic advice, right? So I'm going to go back and forth between A, the way I have it, and B, which is the advice. Listen to the difference in the sub. All right. You may or may not be able to hear that it sounds uneven now, that the subnotes themselves sound uneven, but you can kind of see what the problem is if you look on the graph here. When I leave all these fundamentals alone, they all roll up through the different notes of the sub riff at the same level, and they're not attenuated in different ways, so it's all even sounding subnotes. All the same loudness, every note. Watch this. And let me go back to something a little less annoying sounding, something a little more natural sounding. Let's just turn off the VSX emulation. Okay. See how these harmonics just march right up at the same volume, no matter what, they just march up, boop, 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 same height, same level, same energy. Now watch what happens when I flip over to this low pass, super low in the spectrum, and watch specifically those harmonics and how they stair step and change in height as the fundamental rolls up. So the fundamental's untouched, but the harmonics are getting attenuated with every new note. Watch it. See how that all-important first harmonic, which is really the third harmonic, right? It's super high on the low note, but then it just gets cut down by like 3 or 4 or 5 dB for the next higher notes. And that's going to result in a perceptible difference in the loudness of those subnotes. So this is why I say if you for some reason think you need a clean sub with no harmonics on it, make it. Don't just take a sub that's already dirty with harmonics and then use a low pass filter on it to get rid of those harmonics, because you're still going to hear those harmonics, but it's just going to be a different ratio of harmonics for every pitch in your subline. This whole region is so sensitive, and our ears are very sensitive to it. It's fragile, and you don't want to be putting some steep or even gentle low pass filter right in this region. It's creating problems with just the sound and timbre of the sub itself. It's also doing big, heavy phase shifts and causing more peaks and all kinds of problems. So, if you're going to put a high pass on your sub at all, like it's perfectly fine to just leave these sounds in here. I mean, they're really super low in the mix, but I'm just being careful because I know that these are completely unimportant to the mix and unimportant to the perception of the sub. So because I can see them and I know that they're way up above the sensitive region where we actually hear and perceive the sub, I'm just shaving a little bit of that energy off because it's not helping in any way. It's practically, starting to get up into the region where everything just sounds like hiss. We don't need hiss and air on our sub, right? It's a sub. So it's okay to do this kind of gentle high pass, but not something way down here and steep. Just avoid that. It's bad practice. Okay, so next we want to talk about whether to high pass or low shelf your mid-range sounds to help reduce clutter and buildup in the low end, and to reduce masking and conflict with your bass, since, especially in electronic music, a lot of the mid-range sounds you're going to use may have a sub-element on them, or at least extend deep into the bass region. And you can have some phase interaction and interference between the low end of your mid-range sounds and your sub line, and that mid-range interference, that phasing interference can cause a kind of rubbing or roughness. And we're going to listen to an example of that, how to listen for it, and what to do about it. A general comment I want to make is, you don't want to get too aggressive with high passing everything that's a mid-range sound. And you don't usually want to use really steep high pass filters if you're going to use a high pass filter at all. My recommendation, you want your sounds to glue together. And if you get too crazy with super steep pass filters everywhere, trying to slice up the sounds in your spectrum with these steep filters, you're going to make your sound very disconnected. You need a certain amount of overlap, or not necessarily crossfading, but just overlap and mixing and combining in the regions where sounds interact. And you want to use gentle filters. You want to attenuate the places where masking is happening. You don't want to remove it necessarily entirely, or things will get a little artificial and disconnected sounding. So my advice in general, when you're trying to keep your low end clean and decide how much of a mid-range sound to high pass out or low shelf out, try a low shelf filter first, just to push down energy that's happening in the sub and bass region a little bit, and see if that'll do the job. And if it won't do the job, then go ahead and switch to a high pass filter, but try to keep it really gentle, like a 12 dB shallow high pass filter. Let some of that low end and sub energy blend in with your actual sub area, because that's going to help your overall mix sound a little more glued. You just want to control the blending, right? You're not trying to completely eliminate the blending. And where you set the filter point will affect a lot the interaction with the sub, and that's what I'm about to demonstrate. And then I'll talk about this last line in a second. So let's first show you what the rubbing sounds like if we do it wrong. We're going to use isolate again. We'll probably want to go back to VSX. Okay, we're going to look at a Pro Q3 instance that's on this rolling bass sound. So this sound here is what we're listening to. So we're going to compare what that sounds like with the sub by soloing this as well. We're going to make sure we're listening to the right sub. Yep, that's the one we want. Okay, so this is a sub with harmonics, and let's hear them together with the full spectrum at first. We'll use the big far field monitors just so you can hear it a little cleanly. Okay. They sound fairly glued together. They don't sound too independent. Let's hear this in the big club mix, the club emulation. Now, that sounds clean. We don't hear any weird interaction between those two frequencies. They sound fairly glued. Let's just walk through all the emulations real quick so you can hear this combination of sounds in all the emulations. And we'll stay on the club emulation for the rest of this part because this is where we're going to hear the problem the most clearly. So you'll notice I'm bracketing this rolling bass sound with a high pass filter on the left, a low pass filter on the right. I'll talk about this part in the next segment of the video. Right now, I want to focus on why I'm bracketing out the low end and why I'm bracketing out here at 244 with a 12 dB high pass filter. I'm going to turn this filter on and off, and I want you to listen in this environment where the problem will be really clear. Listen to how the phase interaction of the information that's hiding down here in that rolling bass line, that mid-range sound, how it interacts with the sub itself and causes some audible problems. Let's turn this off. Actually, I'll do it this way so you can see it go on and off better. So this is with it off. Do you hear that kind of rubbing, gritty sound? Now when I turn the filter on again, sounds much more smooth. That gritty rub, that gritty, grating, rubby sound is gone from the low end. Let's make it a little more obvious now by just soloing the low end. Now you're hearing a little bit of a wobble, but that wobble is the part of the mid-range that's extending down through this gentle slope. You're actually hearing that coming from this sound itself. It's not on the sub. And so it makes it sound like there's a clear sub, but then there's a little bit of a wobbly movement on top of it. But it's not a phasing, rubbing kind of problem, a gritty sound. It's just a waffle, a wobbly texture on top of it. And it's not obscuring the sub range by any means. It's just adding an interesting texture to the sub. Now I'm going to turn this up a little bit, keeping an eye on not overblowing YouTube. Okay, so it's a sub with that little waffly texture on top of it. Now listen to when I turn off this filter. Hear how muddy and disjointed that sounds now? Hear that rubby, gritty, it's all grindy and gritty. And that's the phase interaction of all the low frequencies that are happening in this mid-range bass sound. All those, gritty, rumbly, low-range frequencies interacting with the fairly clean, with harmonics, sub. Versus this. So just taking that much energy away is cleaning up the low end a lot and reducing the mud and the interaction that is very unpleasant. And it's very easy to hear the problem, especially when we isolate just the low end. It's very easy to hear the problem in an emulation like this. It's much harder to hear it on small speakers. Listen to it on, we've got the same low frequency solo happening below 200 hertz right here. But now we're going to listen to it on these relatively small barefoots. Okay, you can hear it a little bit now that you know what to listen for. I mean, it's still fairly obvious. We'll hear it a little more clearly on this emulation. Versus. So it's just something to think about, right? If you have a way to, solo your low end, maybe 200 hertz and below, 150 hertz and below, and try to listen on the biggest speakers you can, or the most, a sub pack or an emulation, certainly like, the big club emulation, you're going to hear this problem a lot more clearly. This is fairly clean, and that's just a mess, right? So again, these are the kind of things that when you're a producer doing, your cool rad dubstep or rhythm or whatever in your home studio on your small 5-inch near field monitors, you're gonna have a hard time hearing this. And then, if you play it out at a club, or a friend plays it out at a club or whatever, this kind of roughness and rubbing is just going to come through loud and clear in an environment like this, and it's not a good thing. So it's the kind of thing you should try to be aware can happen and definitely take care of it. And so, you're going to hear out there on YouTube, don't overdo it with the low passing everything. And that's absolutely true, especially in genres that aren't dance music. Like if you're doing a rock mix or an alternative mix or a jazz mix, you don't want to take away the bottom fatness and roughness of all your mid-range sounds, your guitars and certain horns and certain, piano and synthesizer sounds in a more of a jazz context. You want them to have some bottom end. You need them to have some heft. And you don't want to just cut all that away just because you have a bass player, right? And a kick drum. You need it to blend a little more, and you don't have to worry necessarily about this degree of interaction in a rock album, rock mix, alternative mix, that kind of thing. But in dance music in particular, especially if you're playing in the bass-heavy, sub-heavy genres of dance music, oh yeah, you need to be very aware of this, and you probably are going to find yourself either low shelving or high passing a lot of this energy away from your subregion on all of your mid-bass sounds and all of your mid-range sounds, because what's going on down here can interact with the sub in a very rough way and just make the whole bottom end muddy and woofy. And a lot of people will call it rumble because it sounds like rumble, but it's not technically rumble the way most engineers think of rumble. I just think of it as roughness and rubbing, a kind of rubbing, gritty sound. So be aware of that, be ready to do this. And where you set this filter point is really a matter of doing it by ear and taking away only what you have to from the subregion to clean up that low end and clean up and remove that rubbing. And this is where this last line comes into play. Sometimes when you high pass a mid-range sound far enough up to clean up your sub region and your low bass region and get rid of that roughness and that grittiness, by the time you do that, you may find that your mid-range sound is now a little bit thin even in the context of the full mix, and you wish you could put some beef back into the bottom of it. And this is why, again, you don't want to get too heavy-handed, especially in other genres. But in this case, this is a club genre. I need to clean up that low end. Otherwise, it just sounds horrid in a club environment, right? But there is a way to put some of the beef back into it when you're done. And so let me show you how that works. I'm going to go back to just more of a full but heavy mix using these far fields in this room. And we're going to unsolo these two things. We're going to take off the low end, and we're going to hear the full mix now. Here we go. Okay, that sounds pretty good. They're glued together. The rolling bass doesn't sound too thin, right? But there's a trick here. I have an instance of Spectre sitting on this rolling bass. And it's sitting right here after some of the early stuff and after the, actually in front of the Pro Q3. So you could think of it in the signal chain as Spectre's coming before this actual filter bump. And you can see where Spectre is doing a boost between 100 and 300. So it's doing a boost right around this filter point. And let me turn off Spectre and show you what it sounds like without that little bump. If I do and turn you off. Okay, so Spectre's off. Now listen to the whole mix without this extra added set of saturation and this low bass end of things. It doesn't sound terrible, but the rolling bass sound and the sub now feel just a tiny bit disconnected. They don't feel glued together. Listen to it again. You've got plenty of low end in the song between the kick and the sub itself and all the harmonics in the sub, but it feels disconnected from your main mid-range sound that's being featured as like the main thing of interest. And that's happening in large part because of this filter. If I turn this filter off, the mid-range bass is going to sound a bit more prominent and sitting in the mix where it should, but it's also going to feel a little rubby and rumbly down in the low end. See how much fatter and fuller the rolling bass sounds? So it's kind of you have this trade-off. To clean up the low end and that weird rubby rumble in the low end, you have to high pass it, and you have to high pass it about to here to take out enough energy here to clean that up. But then it sounds a little thin and it sounds a little disconnected, right? So the trick, and this is one of the reasons I recommend Spectre as a really, really good way to do this kind of colored saturation in a way that's better than just pushing EQ in this area. Like if I tried to add another filter here and push it up again, it's just not going to sound nearly the same or as good as what I'm doing with this move right here. So watch what happens when I turn on Spectre, when this little yellow dot right here lights up. Okay, so how can I explain this? I really do not want to make this video like 30 minutes longer by teaching you all the ins and outs of Spectre and why it's different than an EQ. What we're doing is we're basically taking the original signal and we're adding more harmonics that are really tightly specific to the 200 hertz region. And I did it by ear. I put it in front of this filter and just reached around and knew I wanted to beef up this region a little bit, but without hitting this region and pumping this up, which is what an EQ boost would do. I wanted to do something really surgical right around this very prominent area where the low fundamental of this rolling bass sound is sitting. Look at the fundamentals here. Okay, the fundamentals right here, the first few harmonics are here. We've attenuated the fundamental because it's part of what's contributing to the rumble down here, or the roughness and rubbing. But if I can accentuate these first sets of also important timbral harmonics right here in this region, I can bring back some of the perceived beef around this, 250 hertz region. And I don't want to overdo it because this region can also get cluttered if you put too many things here. But in this case, it works out just right to take a boost that looks fairly wide here, but really under the covers, it's actually kind of focused to just the 200 hertz region. And so it's focusing right here. And it's almost kind of like if I had done something like this, but different and better. That's the best way I can describe it. It's kind of accentuating right here, but with saturation and harmonics that are really happening further up the spectrum. But to your brain, it sounds like we're increasing the density right here. And that's the big difference between using parallel saturation in this colored kind of way versus an EQ boost. Right? So it just ends up being a lot less phase shift, a lot less problematic boosting of things below and around this region. It's just accentuating right here in a way where, your brain is tricked by harmonics really happening more like through here to feel like this section is louder despite the filtering, right? So on and off again. This is on. Off. See how there's not nearly as much beef again? On. And now we've got that beef. So this is kind of an advanced thing, and I know some of you will balk at the cost of something like Spectre. You can use FabFilter Saturn if you have that. I know a lot of people have Saturn, and you can try the same thing by making a band around the 200 hertz region and saturating the 200 hertz region. It won't sound quite the same as Spectre. It won't sound quite as clean and transparent as Spectre. Spectre really sounds more than anything like an EQ boost, but it's not doing it like an EQ boost. It does it differently. And it's just my favorite way to take any part of a sound that doesn't feel like it's loud enough, any part of the spectrum, and just boost that part of the spectrum really transparently compared to doing it with an EQ. And that's all I can say. I really shouldn't belabor this point too much more. But this is something you need to think about. When you take care of your low end, you might have to do something to also bring the beef back in, or just find a different sound that doesn't have as much rumble down in the low end. Or we could have tried to do this with the low shelf and find the exact right spot for the low shelf. I don't know. Let's see what happens if we try that. Let me copy this over to the B slot. Let's go to B. Let's set this to a low shelf. And let's go try to find something here that'll do the same thing. Again, I'm listening for rumble, so I'm going to solo just the midline bass and the sub so I can hear them interacting together. We're going to really isolate the low frequency range, and I'm going to go to the club emulation so that the problems are really, really apparent. And let's see what we find. I'm still hearing that grittiness, so let's try moving this around until I don't hear the grittiness anymore. Also, let me take off Spectre so it's not confusing things. Okay, that's not too bad. That cleaned up the rumble quite a bit. So now let's turn off our low frequency solo, bring everything back, listen to the full mix. We'll listen to it here in the bigger, nice, clean, pretty sounding far field monitors in this room. And I'll kind of toggle between Spectre with my low pass filter versus not having Spectre on with this low shelf filter. I'm sorry, the other one was a high pass filter versus just the low shelf filter all by itself. And let's see if we can hear a difference. Let's actually just listen to the difference in the roller bass itself with nothing else. So this is one filter versus the other. Okay, see how this one with the high pass sounds a lot more thin, right? And then the low shelf isn't removing quite as much all the way down here. You're keeping some of that. And so it still sounds beefier when we put it on. Right? That sounds much better in terms of full spectrum. But again, you have to listen to everything in the context of the full mix and the interaction with other elements. And so if we bring back the sub and see how it interacts with the sub, and we listen to just the low frequency range with, again, this shape versus the high pass plus Spectre. And let's see how they sound different. We're going to solo just the low frequencies again. That was Spectre in this shape. With just the low pass filter. Okay, so on this emulation, they sound about the same. Let's hear what it sounds like in a bigger club with lots of reverberation and phasing that's going to highlight the problem better. Let's see what it sounds like here. Okay, they sound closer. I can still hear a little bit more of that grittiness and that rumble when we use this approach without Spectre. So that's why I chose to do it this way with a little extra bump from Spectre to bring the fatness back, because it is cleaner in the low end. But the difference wasn't huge, right? So if you don't have something like Spectre or a tool that can do something like Spectre, you could choose to instead follow my very first advice on this slide, which was, in general, try a low shelf first to clean up most of your muddy, rubby, rumbly low-end problems, right? Don't overdo it, because if you overdo it with high-pass filters, you're going to thin out your mid-basses and your mid-range sounds too much, and then you're going to need something like Spectre to put some of the beef back in the bottom end. So in this case, since I have Spectre, I get a better overall result by using this kind of filter plus Spectre. But you, if you don't have something like Spectre, could get really close to what I got just by using this kind of low shelf shape instead. Okay, so again, this is kind of really advanced low-end mixing stuff. Some of you may have a hard time really dissecting this, but play with it, practice it with it in your own mixes. Find any tool you can to let you solo frequency ranges and isolate them and listen to them and see what you can, eventually kind of come to naturally on your own as a way to control rumble and roughness and rubbing and, gappiness and pumping that happens down in your low end. Okay, Thanks for hanging with me, and I'll see you in the next episode.